Welcome back to the Furnished Mind, and I am excited here. Dr. Jordan Peterson is going to be debating Destiny. So he has Destiny on as a guest. Destiny is a very popular streamer, became prominent through the 2010s, streaming video games, etc. Now he does like a bunch of podcasts. Comes off as somebody who just enjoys being a contrarian. He likes to debate for the sake of debating. Not to say he's not an intelligent guy, but I'll say a majority of his views, like 80% of his views, I disagree with. So it's going to be quite interesting seeing him go toe-to-toe with Jordan Peterson. But let's go ahead and just dive in and just do a live reaction here.
When you look at like the fall of the Soviet Union, or you look at the failure of like socialist or communist regimes, I don't know if the issue there was so much redistribution.
That was one of many issues.
I don't think it was an issue at all, actually.
What do you mean redistribution wasn't an issue? What the hell do you think they did to the kulaks?
If you believe climate models, or if you believe that we're heading in a certain direction.
I don't believe any of those presumptions.
People keep saying that, but we just got another one of the hottest years on record.
That's a classic leftist argument.
Why wouldn't Putin, why wouldn't Xi Jinping, why wouldn't anybody else in the world call this out? It was as horrible as it was.
There are plenty of people attempting to call
Nobody
out
credible.
You really think that you're in a position to evaluate the scientific credibility of the trials for the vaccines, do you? Hello, everyone. I'm here today talking to Stephen Bunnell, known professionally and online as Destiny. He's an American streamer, debater, and political commentator. He really came to my attention, I would say, as a consequence of the discussion he had with Ben Shapiro and Lex Friedman, and I decided to talk to him, not least because it's not that easy to bring people who are identified, at least to some degree, with the political beliefs on the left into a studio where I can actually have a conversation with them. I've tried that more often than you might think, and it happens now and then, but not very often. So today we talk a lot about, well, the differences between the left and the right, and the dangers of political ideology per se, and the use of power as opposed to invitation, and all sorts of other often heated and contentious issues. And so you're welcome to join us. And I was happy to have the opportunity to do this. So I guess we might as well start by letting the people who don't know who you are get to know who you are with a little bit more precision. So why have you become known, and how has that developed?
It's a pretty broad question. I think I started streaming around 15 years ago, when it wasn't really a thing yet. There were a few people that did it. I started early on. I guess back then you weren't a professional gamer yet because the game had just started to come out, but there was a game called StarCraft 2, and I streamed myself playing that game. I was a pretty good player. It was pretty entertaining to watch. And then I kind of grew over, I guess maybe the next 7 years, just streaming that people would watch.
Streaming on YouTube?
Well, back then I started on a website called Livestream, then I switched to Ustream, then I switched to a site called Justin TV, and then that turned into Twitch.tv. So after streaming there for like 7 or 8 years, I was a semi-professional StarCraft 2 gamer. That game kind of came and went, but I had a lot of other interests. Around 2016, I started to get more involved into the world of politics. It's kind of a left-leaning figure because of my background in like esports and internet gaming and internet trash talk. I had more of a kind of like a combative attitude, and that was kind of rare for left-leaning people at the time. So it's basically where my early political popularity came from. I think from like 2016 to 2018 was debating right-wing people.
So was there a game-like element to the debating, do you think? And is that part of why that morphing made sense?
No, I wouldn't say so. I mean, if you get really reductionist, everything in life is kind of a game, but that's not very satisfying. I think I grew up like very argumentative. My mom is from Cuba, so my family was like very conservative. And then I grew up like listening to the news all day, listening to my mom's political opinions all day. And then I argued with kids in high school and everything. And I've always been kind of like an argumentative, type A, aggressive personality. So I think that probably lent itself well to the political stuff in 2016, yeah.
Was that useful in gaming? That personality?
In some ways, yeah. In some ways, no. I don't know directly for the games itself. I don't know how much it necessarily mattered. But for all the peripheral stuff, in some ways it was really beneficial. I could kind of like cut out my own path, and I could be very unique, and I could kind of be on my own. In some ways it was very detrimental. I can be very difficult to get along with, and I'm very much kind of like, I want to do this thing, and if you try to tell me what to do, I don't want to have like a sponsor or a team or anybody kind of with a leash on me. So yeah, I guess it worked out.
It's interesting because the temperamental proclivity that you're describing, that's associated with low agreeableness. And
Yeah.
generally, well, and that's more combative, it's more stubborn,
sure.
it's more implacable, it's more competitive. The downside is that it's more skeptical, it can be more cynical, it can be less cooperative. But generally, a temperament like that is not associated with political belief on the left, because the leftists tend to be characterized by higher levels of compassion, and that's low agreeableness. So, that element of your temperament at least is quite masculine, and a lot of the
I'm interested in how he
ideology
ended up
that
as a liberal.
characterizes the modern left has a much more temperamentally feminine nature. So all right. So why do you think the shift from your popularity to political commentary worked? And you said that started about 2016. And why do you think that shift happened for you, like in terms of your interest?
I think I've always been interested in a lot of things. Like I grew up with a very strong political bend. It was conservative until I got into my streaming years, probably 5 or 6 years into streaming. I slowly kind of started to shift to the left. I would say that, I guess in around 2016, when I saw all of the conversations going on with the election and when all the issues being talked about, I felt like the conversations were very low quality. And in my naivety, I thought that maybe I could come in and boost the quality, at least in like my little corner of the internet, to have better conversations about what was going on. And so that was basically my injection point into all of that was, fighting about those political issues and then arguing with people about them, doing research and reading and all of that. Yeah.
And so did you do that by video to begin with as well?
Yeah, it was all streaming. Yeah.
It was all streaming. And so I presume you built an audience among the people who were following you as a gamer first, and then that started to expand. Is that correct?
Basically, yeah. Without getting too much into like the business or streaming side of things, basically, actually, this probably carries over to basically to all media, I would imagine, is you've got people that will watch you for special events. So maybe you're like a commentator of the Super Bowl, or maybe you're hosting like a really huge event. Then you've got people who will watch you every time you're participating in your area of expertise. So for me, that's like a particular game I might be playing. It might be when you're on like a particular show or something that people watch you for. And then the fundamental fan, like the best fan that you're converting to the lowest and most loyal viewer, I guess, is somebody that's watching you basically no matter what you're doing. And
The only question I have, I wish Jordan would have double backed on, was that transition from conservative to liberal. I want a little bit more information regarding that. Was it more so just ideological conformity with the streamers he was pairing up with? Because in that era, streaming was not cool. It wasn't glamorous. That was usually what like really like nerdy kind of guys did. And I wonder if maybe it was just like a conformity thing where these were the people he was surrounded by and they just had influence over him. But that's kind of interesting to me. Your family was conservative, coming from Cuba especially, knowing that they escaped the Fidel Castro regime and everything. And then for you to transition as liberal in probably your, 2015, 16, he was probably his mid-20s. Why then? But let's go ahead and proceed, though.
are the people that'll follow you from area to area.
Right.
And I think because of the way I did gaming and I talked about a lot of other stuff, whether it was politics, science, current events, whatever, I had a lot of loyal fans that kind of followed me wherever I went. So quite a few of them stuck in Star Trek.
So you established a reputation.
Yeah.
So how would you characterize your reach now? How would you quantify it?
I think can you be more precise?
How many people are watching a typical video that you might produce, and what are you doing for subscribers, say on YouTube, and total? Any idea about total reach?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess my subscribers on YouTube, I have around, I think that's around 770,000 on my main channel. I think I probably do between all three channels, I think around 15 to 20 million views a month. And then I live stream to anywhere from 5 to 15,000 concurrent viewers a day for hopefully around 8 hours a day. Yeah.
Okay. So you have quite a substantial reach. And so you said that initially you were more conservative leaning, but that changed. What did it mean that you were more conservative leaning, and how and why did that change?
When I say I was conservative leaning, I mean I was writing articles for my school newspaper defending George Bush and the Iraq War. I was like very much like, I I think it's like an insult now when people say like neocon, but I was like very much like a conservative, a Bush era conservative. So supported big business, supported traditional, all of the conservative, I guess, like foreign policy, hawkish foreign policy, for whatever that meant as like a 14, 15-year-old.
Right.
There was the whole Elian Gonzalez incident that was very big for Cuban Americans, where there was a Cuban boy that tried to come to the United States with several other people and his mother, and their raft, I guess, crashed or something happened. I think his mom died and some other people died, and there was a huge debate on whether or not to send him back to Cuba, and Clinton ended up sending him back to Cuba. And I know that my mom was super irritated and all that, to say the least. And then once I hit college, I think I supported Ron Paul in 2000, would have been 2008. So I was a big Ron Paul libertarian guy.
Let's just pause right there. If he was supporting Ron Paul, you were a staunch conservative. You were like textbook, like he just said, libertarian, meaning as little government as possible, just enough for the necessary things. But if you're supporting Ron Paul, that's as textbook conservative as you can get. So I like that he's painting this story for us. I'm still waiting for that pivot. But good Lord, I had no idea. This Destiny guy has been on podcasts I've been seeing him probably like the last 3 years on podcasts. And he always has his hair dyed blue. So I just always known him as this very the very articulate, fast talking kind of guy, but just extremely liberal. I knew him for having an open relationship, and I also knew him for being like bisexual as well. But again, let's kind of hear where this pivot. This is interesting. I'm watching this in real time. I have not watched this before, so let's see if he kind of reveals that information.
In high school, when I went to a Catholic Jesuit high school, and I kind of became atheist in that process. I started reading Ayn Rand. So I was very, 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 very conservative.
But on the libertarian end, it sounds
I would say so, yeah. Initially on the,
that makes more sense in relationship to your temperament.
Sure, maybe, yeah. Initially it was like Christian conservative, and then it became like libertarian conservative. My life kind of took like a wacky path, and then as I started working, I kind of had to drop out of school. I was working, and then I got into streaming. And once I started streaming, I had a son, basically around the first year I started streaming. As I started to go through life, and I went from kind of being in this like working poor position to making a lot of money, especially through the lens of my child, I saw how different life was when I had more money versus less. And I guess like the differences between what was available to me and then my child, as I made more money, while I was really wealthy versus not as wealthy, it kind of started to change the way that I guess.
So you got more attuned to the consequences of inequality?
Basically.
So basically, it sounds like you're exposed to this whole new wave of like white guilt. You started making money. You have a son now. You start making a bunch of money, and now you're looking at the world like, I shouldn't be making this kind of money. I need to find a way to redistribute it. There's so many people who are poor. I remember when I was poor just a few months ago. If you work hard for your income and you put the work in and you do it legally, the right way, there's nothing to be ashamed of. There's nothing to be ashamed of having wealth in our country. That's one of these weird ideologies that are just being espoused onto our children, the younger generation. A lot of kids who have a solid foundation, both parents in the home, live in a good community, they got investments, good money in the bank. They're so ashamed to let people know that that's what they have. It's the weirdest thing ever, but again, it sounds like that spirit of guilt hit them. But let's continue.
Would say, yeah.
Okay, and so how did that lead you to develop more sympathy for left-leaning ideas, particularly?
I guess my core beliefs have never really changed, but I think the way that those become applied kind of change. So much the same way that you might think that everybody deserves a shot to go to school and have an education. That might be like a core belief, where as a libertarian or conservative, I might think that as long as a school is available, everybody's got the opportunity to go and study. But maybe now as like a liberal or progressive or whatever you'd call me, I might say, okay, well, we need to make sure that there's enough, maybe like food in the household or some kind of funding program to make sure the kid can actually go to school and study, basically. So like the core drive is the same, but I think the applied principle ends up changing a bit based on what you think people's individual
is your
sense are.
concern essentially something like the observation that if people are bereft enough of substance, let's say, that it's difficult for them to take advantage of equal opportunities, even if they are presented to them, let's say.
Yeah, essentially, yeah.
And you have some belief, and correct me if I'm wrong, you have some belief that there is room for state intervention at the level of basic provision to make those opportunities more manifest.
Yeah, to varying degrees, yeah.
Okay. So let's start talking more broadly then on the political side. So how would you characterize the difference, in your opinion, between the left and the conservative political viewpoints?
On a very, very, very broad level, if there's some like good world that we're all aiming for, I think people on the left seem to think that a collection of taxes from a large population that goes into a government that's able to precisely kind of dole out where that tax money goes. You're basically able to take the problems of society. You're able to scrape off, hopefully, not super significant amount of money from people that can afford to give a lot of money, and then through government programs and redistribution, you target those taxes essentially to people that kind of need whatever bare minimum to take advantage of opportunities in society. Yeah.
Okay.
And then on the conservative end, I guess a conservative would generally think that, why would the government take my money? I think from a community point of view, through churches, through community action, through families, we can better allocate our own dollars to our own friends and family to help them and give them the things that they need so that they can better participate in and thrive in society, basically.
Okay, so one of the things that I've always found a mystery, I think there's an equal mystery on the left and on the right in this regard, is that the more conservative types tend to be very skeptical of big government, and the leftist types tend to be more skeptical of big corporations. Right? Well, following through the logic that you just laid out, you made the suggestion that one of the things that characterizes people on the left is the belief that government can act as an agent of can and should act as an agent of distribution. Okay, a potential problem for that is the gigantism of the government that does that. Now, the conservatives are skeptical of that gigantism, and likewise, the liberals, the progressives in particular, we'll call them progressives, are skeptical of the reach of gigantic corporations. And I've always seen a commonality in those two, in that both of them are skeptical of gigantism. And so one of the things that I'm concerned about, generally speaking, with regard to the potential for the rise of tyranny is the emergence of giants. And one potential problem with the view that the government can and should act as an agent of redistribution is that there is an incentive put in place, two kinds of incentives. Number one, a major league incentive towards gigantism and tyranny. And number two, an incentive for psychopaths who use compassion to justify their grip on power, to take money and to claim that they're doing good. And I see that happening everywhere now particularly in the name of compassion. And it's one of the things that's made me very skeptical, in particular about the left, and at least about the progressive edge of the left. So I'm curious about what you think about those two. First of all, it's a paradox to me that the conservatives and the leftists face off each other with regard to their concern about different forms of gigantism, and don't seem to notice that the thing that unites them is some antipathy. This is especially true for the libertarians, some antipathy towards gigantic structures per se. And so then I would say, with regards to your antithesis between liberalism and conservatives, the conservatives are pointing to the fact that there are intermediary forms of distribution that can be utilized to solve the social problems that you're describing that don't bring with them the associated problem of gigantism. And it's been shocking to me to watch the left, especially in the last 6 years, ally itself, for example, with pharmaceutical companies, which was something I'd never thought I would see in my lifetime. I mean, for decades, the only gigantic corporations the left was more skeptical of than the fossil fuel companies were the pharmaceutical companies. And that all seemed to vanish overnight around the COVID time.
Just knowing Destiny and where he stands, this is going to turn into a big vaccine debate, and we're gonna see. I want to see how they hash this out, because I'm ready for it. Again, I'm watching this in real time. I haven't watched this yet, but let's go ahead and proceed.
So I know the story. That's a lot of things to throw at you, but it sort of outlines the territory that we could probably investigate productively.
Yeah, so a couple things. I would say that the current political landscape we have, I think, is less. I understand the concept of conservatives supporting corporations and liberals supporting like large government. I think today the divide we're starting to see more and more is more of like a populist, anti-populist rise, or even like an institutional or anti-institutional rise. So, for instance, I think conservatives today in the United States are largely characterized with, I would say, with populism. In that they're supporting like certain figures, namely right now Donald Trump, who they think alone can kind of like lead them against the corrupt institutions, be them corporate or government. I feel like most conservatives today are not as trustful of big corporations as they were back in like the Bush era, where we would, conservatives would champion, big corporations.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah.
That's a strange thing because it makes the modern conservatives a lot more like the 60s leftists.
Potentially, yeah.
I mean, that brings us into the issue, too, of whether the left-right divide is actually a reasonable way of construing the current political landscape at all. And I'm not sure it is, but...
Right now, it kind of is, but only because so many conservatives are following Trump. So like your populist, anti-populist thing kind of maps on kind of cleanly to the left and right. It doesn't work with progressives, though, or the far left, because they're also anti-large everything. So in a surprising way, on very, very far left people, you might find them having a bit more in common with kind of like a MAGA Trump supporter than like a center-left liberal. So for instance, like both of these groups of people on the very far left will be very dovish on foreign policy, probably a little bit more isolationist. They're not a big fan of like a ton of immigration or a ton of trade with other countries. They might think that there's a lot of institutional capture of both government and corporations. So both all of the MAGA supporters and the far, far left might think that corporations don't have our best interest at heart and the government is corrupt and captured by lobbyists. You'll see a lot of overlap there.
Right.
I think that sometimes there's a couple things. One, this is something I feel like I've discovered. People have no principles. I think that people are largely guided by whatever is kind of satisfying them or making them feel good at the time. I think that's a really important thing to understand because people's beliefs will seem to change at random. If you're trying to imagine that a belief is coming from some underlying principle or is governed by some internal, like moral or reasonable code or whatever. I think generally there are large social groups and people kind of follow them along from thing to thing, which is why you end up in strange worlds sometimes where, like the position on vaccines and being an anti-vaxxer might have been seen as something, 10 years ago as kind of like a hippie leftist. And now maybe it's more like a conservative or it's associated more with like MAGA Trump supporters or whatever. I think as a result of how the social groups move around. When it comes to you mentioned this like gigantism thing. That's another thing where I'm not sure if people actually care about gigantism or if they're using it as a proxy for other things that they don't like. Like I could totally imagine.
Well, I care about it.
Sure. Yeah, you might. Yeah, sorry. It just meant in general.
That's okay.
Because like I could imagine somebody saying that like they don't trust like a large government, they think there's too much, prone to tyranny or something like that, but also be supportive of an institution like the Catholic Church, which is literally, one guy who is a direct line to God.
But they can't tax.
And
they don't have a military. They can't conscript you.
True.
Right?
Yeah.
And they can't throw you in jail.
That is true. Yeah. I mean,
well, those are major and significant. I mean, I get the overlap. Don't get me wrong.
Sure. But I'm saying like, even if you had a local government, if you had a state government or a tribe, usually they've got some form of enacting punishment. It'll be sometimes more brutal, but they can throw you in jail. Conscription hasn't existed in the U.S. since the Vietnam War.
Yet.
I mean, yet. Yeah, true. Yes.
Yeah, true.
So yeah, I think that I guess when I look at
let's go back. Let's go back to the redistribution issue.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we pay 65% of our income at, say, upper middle class to upper middle class level in Canada. It isn't obvious to me at all that money is well used. In fact, quite the contrary. In my country now, our citizens make they produce 60% of what you produce in the U.S. That's plummeted over the last 20 years as state intervention has increased. I'm not convinced that the claim that the interests of people who lack opportunity are best served by state intervention. And there's a couple of reasons for that. I mean, first of all, I'm aware of the relationship between inequality and social problem.
Mm-hmm.
There's a very well-developed literature on that, and it essentially shows that the more arbitrary the broader the reach of inequality in a political institution of any given size, the more social unrest. So where all people are poor, there isn't much social unrest, and where all people are rich, there isn't much social unrest. But when there's a big gap between the two, there's plenty, and that's mostly driven by disaffected young men who aren't very happy that they can't climb the hierarchy. There are barriers in their way. And so there is reason to ameliorate relative poverty. The problem with that, to some degree, is that most attempts to ameliorate relative poverty tend to increase absolute poverty, and they do it dramatically. Wow. And the only solution that we've ever been able to develop to that is something approximating a free market system. I wouldn't call it a capitalist system because I think that's capture of the terminology by the radical leftists. It's a free exchange system. And the price you pay for a free exchange system is you still have inequality, but the advantage you gain is that the absolute levels of privation plummet. And I think the data...
Sorry to interrupt Dr. Jordan Peterson, but he's 100% correct. Capitalism does not have to be the end all be all. We don't have to stop here. But in terms of economic systems developed thus far, is the only one known to mankind that allowed us to escape poverty, all within one lifetime. There has not been another economic system that has eradicated poverty to the level that we've seen in the Western world. Somebody can come here not knowing the language, not having any formal education, and all within one lifetime, if they outwork, out-hustle everyone else, they can transform their life to a bottom 10% to a top 10%. All based on the hard work that they put in. And capitalism allows for that to happen. Now, when it comes to socialism, communism, absolutely not. Communism, all rights are only granted to you by big government. And obviously they can enforce it through the use of force. So if you can't, obviously no free speech. You're not gonna own guns. You don't own your property. There's no private property. There's nothing that's privately owned. They control the barrier to enter and exit any industry. So you can't just be like, oh, tomorrow I'm gonna start a new business. I'm gonna start a food truck. I'm gonna start a cleaning business. I'm gonna start, that doesn't exist unless you have the necessary ingredients which are found in capitalism. Now, obviously, I would love to see capitalism evolve because obviously it's not perfect. There'll still be those who are poor. There'll still be those who are impoverished, and that's going to happen. But as of right now, there is no other economic system that has done what we've seen thus far. But let's go ahead and continue.
I think they're absolutely conclusive, especially, and that's been especially demonstrated in the radical decrease in rates of poverty since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989, because we've lifted more people out of poverty in the last 4 decades than we had in the entire course of human history up to that date. And that's not least because the statist interventionist types who argued for a radical state-sponsored redistribution lost the Cold War, right? And that freed up Africa to some degree, and certainly the Southeast Asian countries, to pursue something like a free trade economy. And that instantly made them rich, even China. So that's an argument, let's say, on the side of free exchange, but it's also an argument, a twofold argument, pointing out how we ameliorate absolute poverty, which should be a concern for leftists, but doesn't seem to be anymore, by the way, and also an argument for the maintenance of a necessary inequality. Like, I'm not sure that inequality can be decreased beyond a certain degree without that decrease causing other serious problems. And we can talk about that, but it's a complicated problem.
Yeah, for one point of clarification, when you say leftist, what do you mean by that?
Well, I was going with your definition, like essentially the core idea being something like the central problem being one of relative inequality in distribution of resources, and the central solution to that being something like state-sponsored economic intervention. I mean, there's other ways we could define left and right, and we can do that, but I'll stick with the one that you brought forward to begin with.
Gotcha. Okay. I only want to be clear on that because because people get mad if I call myself a leftist. Oftentimes online or especially in Europe or worldwide, leftists will refer exclusively to like socialists or communists, and anybody to the right of that would be considered like a liberal. If you
No,
believe, like,
usually a fascist.
Well, depending on who you're
Very
talking about,
rapidly.
Yeah. I just wanted to be clear on that. So I'm absolutely a pro-capitalist, pro-free market guy. I'm never gonna.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
no idea.
Okay. Well, that's good. It's good to get that clear. Why?
Yeah. Because I would argue that when you look at like the fall of the Soviet Union, or you look at the failure of like socialist or communist regimes, I don't know if the issue there was so much redistribution. I think the problem.
That was one of many issues.
I don't think it was an issue at all, actually, I would say. I think the
internal
issue
struggle
was
with that.
command
Wait a
economies.
minute. Wait
Go ahead.
Wait a minute. What do you mean redistribution wasn't an issue? What the hell do you think they did to the kulaks? That was forced redistribution. It resulted in the death of 6 million people. So maybe I'm not understanding what you mean, but that was redistribution at its like pinnacle.
Sure.
And forced redistribution. And it was brutal.
When I think of the strengths of capitalism, the ability for markets to dynamically respond to shifting consumer demand is like the reason why capitalism and free market economies dominate the world. When you've got socialist or communist systems, command economies, where a government is trying to say, this is how much this is going to cost, this is how much you're going to produce and make. This is a failed way of managing a state economy. Even in places where they still do it, there are always shadow economies and stuff. There were in the Soviet Union that prop up where people try to basically ameliorate the conditions that are resulting from said horrible command economy practices. So I guess in a way you could argue a command economy is kind of like redistribution. It's a form of it, but
no, it's a worse problem. If you're pointing to the fact that that's a worse problem, I'm with you
I would say that's
100%.
definitely the reason why these places failed, because they just weren't able to respond to changing conditions.
Okay, so what's the difference between us?
You started off as a staunch Ron Paul style libertarian. You transitioned into becoming a little more liberal once you had your son and you started making money. Those are the two strongest components. Like I said, there was the whole white guilt, the spirit of white guilt that allowed him to feel that. And then he swapped positions to a more liberal position. But he's liberal, but he also says that he believes free market capitalism is the best position. This is very intriguing because most liberals would argue the opposite. They would actually argue you down and make the claim why all these socialist Scandinavian nations are thriving because they're more egalitarian, they're socialist, free this, free that, education, healthcare, blah, blah, blah. He's very different. He's very different. You can't pinpoint him on certain positions. I still think he's holding back in terms of why he is liberal, but let's go ahead and just continue. Let's continue.
Okay, so what's the difference between a state that attempts to redistribute to foster equality of opportunity and a command economy? Is it a difference of degree? Like, are you looking at models, let's say, like the Scandinavian countries? Or I wouldn't use Canada, by the way, because Canada is now, what would you call, predicted by economic analysts to have the worst performing economy for the next 4 decades of all the developed world. So maybe we'll just leave the example of Canada off the table.
Sure.
Scandinavian countries are often the polities that are pointed to by, I would say, by people who, at least in part, are putting forward a view of redistribution for purposes of equality of opportunity like you are. But they're a strange analogy because they're very small countries, and up till now they were very ethnically homogenous.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that makes a big difference when you're trying to flatten out the redistribution. Plus, they are also incredibly wealthy, which makes, redistribution, let's say, a lot easier. So why doesn't a government that's bent on redistribution fall prey to the pitfalls of command economy and forced redistribution, for that matter? How do you protect against that?
I think what you have to do is very, very, very difficult. Is people get very ideologically captured by both ends, and they feel very, committed, or they feel very allegiant to pushing certain forms of economic organization. And I think sometimes it blinds them to some of the benefits of what exists when you incorporate kind of multiple models, or I mean, you'd call them mixed economies, which is really what every capitalist economy today is. It's some form of free market capitalism combined with some form of like government intervention to control for negative externalities. These are the ways that all economies, even in Scandinavia and the world, work. And I think that recognizing the benefits of both systems are the best way to make things work. Yeah.
Fair enough. And the Scandinavian countries seem to have done a pretty good job of that. But like I said, they have a simpler problem to solve, let's say, than the Americans have. Negative externalities. That's an interesting rabbit hole to wander down, because the problem I have with negative externalities, you made a case already that, and again, correct me if I've got this wrong, but I think that I understood what you said. A free market, free exchange economy is a gigantic distributed computational device.
Basically, yeah.
Right, exactly. And
which, funnily enough, one of the big problems for command economies is called the computation problem, because no central body can actually compute, the ins and outs of.
Right, exactly. Right, that's a fatal problem, right? Because it doesn't have the computational power. It certainly doesn't have the speed of data recognition. It doesn't have the on-the-ground agents if all of the perception and decision-making is centralized, right? It's way too low resolution. It's going to crash. Okay, and I think that that's comprehensible technically as well as ideologically. All right, but having said that, with regards to externalities, all the externalities that a market economy can't compute are so complex that they can't be determined centrally by the same argument. And
there are ways to account for them, though.
Really?
That work with.
Tell me.
Yeah.
How. Because I can't see that. Because I can't see how that they can be accounted for without the same computational problem immediately arising.
Yeah, and I understand that. And I think that's a problem sometimes of people very far on the left when they want to deal with certain problems. I think that they want to bring like heavy-handed, like things like price controls in to say, well, we need less of this, so let's just make this cost this particular thing, which ironically enough introduces a whole other set of externalities that will happen when you get a lot of friction between where your price floor or ceiling is set compared to what a market was set at. But ideally, if you're a reasonable person and you view economies as mixed economies, what you try to do is you try to take these externalities, meaning things that aren't accounted for with your primary system. So in a capitalist system, an externality might be something that causes a negative effect, but it doesn't cost you any money. Pollution would be a good example of that. And rather than saying like, well, no company can pollute this much, or, if you're a company, you have to use these things because the other things are making too much pollution, all you do is you say, okay, well, if we've determined that, say, carbon is bad for the atmosphere, well, we're just going to attach a little price to that. The government is going to say that, if you pollute this much, here's the price. And then if you want to pay for it, you can. But that type of intervention in the economy basically allows the free market to hopefully do its job, because the government has tacked on a little bit of a price something that tries to account for the cost of that externality. Yeah.
Great. That's a great example. We can go right down that rabbit hole. Carbon. Okay, so first of all, one of the things I've seen, you tell me what you think about this, something that I've seen that actually shocks me, that I was interested in watching over the last 5 or 6 years. I wondered what would happen when the left, the progressives, ran into a conundrum. And the conundrum is quite straightforward. If you pursue carbon pricing and you make energy more expensive, then you hurt the poor. And I don't think you just hurt them. In fact, I know you just don't hurt them. I heard a man 2 days ago who's fed 350 million people in the course of his life, heading the UN's largest relief agency, make the claim quite straightforwardly that misappropriation on the part of interventionist governments increased the rate of absolute privation dramatically in the world over the last 4 or 5 years. And that has happened not least because of carbon pricing, not just carbon pricing, but the insistence that carbon per se is an externality that we should control. Now, Germany's paid a radical price for that, for example. So their power is now about 5 times as expensive as it could be. And they pollute more per unit of power than they did 10 years ago before they introduced these policies that were hypothetically there to account for externality. And the externality was carbon dioxide. I don't think that's a computable externality. And I don't think there's any evidence whatsoever that it's actually an externality that we should be warping the economic system to ameliorate, if the cost of that, and it will be an increase in absolute privation among the world's poor. So, and here's an additional argument on that front with regards to externalities. You get that wrong, and here's something you could get right instead. If you ameliorate absolute poverty among the world's 1 billion poorest, they take a longer view of the future. And that means they become environmentally aware. And so the fastest route to a sustainable planet could well be the remediation of absolute poverty. And the best route to that is cheap energy. And we're interfering with the development of cheap energy by meddling with the hypothetically detrimental externality of carbon dioxide. And so I think this is a complete bloody travesty, by the way. We are putting the lives of hundreds of millions of people directly at risk right now to hypothetically save people in the future, depending on the accuracy of our projections 100 years out. And these interventionists, these people who are remediating externalities, they actually believe that they can calculate an economic projection 1 century out. That's utterly delusional.
So, okay, so just to be clear, the first thing, I was just giving an example of how you can use like a government intervention to make a free market track something, which is what cap and trade or like carbon taxes would do. I wasn't necessarily speaking to the strength of that individual thing, but
but that's a good thing to focus on.
Yeah, we can focus on that as well.
Major externality.
We can focus on that as well. So,
this whole carbon conversation is so interesting, and why I also believe it falls into this whole end times narrative, because they found a way. Well, first, just to set the table, there are so many different mechanisms needed to contribute to control every aspect of your life. So it's very difficult. But this whole carbon tax thing, this is the first time they're able to comprehensively say, we can control every aspect of your life down to what you drive, what you eat, where you're traveling to. Why do you have to travel to the grocery store across town when you have one right next to you? Who you're with. Everything, every aspect of your life can be controlled using this whole carbon nonsense. And guess what? It's going to work. And they're going to continue to pass this nonsense. This whole Greta Thunberg, I know she's memed everywhere for her horrible takes and complete reliance on emotionalism. This is going to be sad because this is going to be used in the end times. And don't be surprised because right now, people don't realize that mainstream media is not covering it. They're using their bad carbon policies to put a death to agriculture as a whole in our nation. Farmers have been complaining for a long time, but the average person does not know this because they don't hear it if it's not on mainstream media. They've been being attacked by legislators who live in big metro cities who are passing bills on farms and rural communities that they've never visited. They don't even understand how it works in these rural communities, but they're passing bills to make life difficult for them. Telling them how many cows they can produce and purchase and how to tax them and what you can do, what you have to do with your chickens. And it's making it so difficult. These farmers can't even afford to run a simple operation. And of course, that's why we're starting to see such a spike in the cost of like beef and everything else. It's all by plan. And of course, I mean, come guys, you want green plants on planet Earth? What do you think they use to convert to oxygen? So this whole idea of we're going to eradicate carbon emissions on planet Earth is just asinine. But let's continue. We're going to have a greenless Earth, I guess.
The first thing, this is going to sound mean, but I'm very realistic. There needs to be a better argument than just it disproportionately impacts the poor. That's not always
a classic leftist argument.
Sure, it might be, but
right, but it's the same argument you made to justify your swing to the left at the beginning of our discussion. You said that you were looking at economic inequalities that disproportionately affected the poor. So I can't see why. And I'm not trying to be mean about this either. I can't see why you could base your argument that it was morally appropriate for you to swing to the left from your previous position because you saw disproportionate effects on the poor. And I can't use that argument in the situation that I'm presenting it right now.
Well, because it depends on if we think it's a condition that ought to be remedied or not. For instance, if I walk, around and I see homeless people and I'm like, man, this is really sad. We ought to spend more money on homeless people because it seems like they're disproportionately affected by their living conditions. And then somebody says, oh, well, do you think we should still lock up, rapists and murderers? Aren't they disproportionately poor? I'd probably say, well, yeah, we probably should. And I go, well, isn't that hypocritical? Well, no, I think that rapists and murderers should probably be in jail, but we can also help the homeless at the same time. I think that just helping the poor isn't an argument, like a blank check to do every possible thing to satisfy poorer people.
Right,
it's going to depend on from issue to issue.
That's fine.
So, like, for instance, I think
because the poor, everyone who's poor is not a victim. some people who are poor are psychopathic perpetrators.
Sure.
And it's very useful to distinguish them. But I was making a much more specific argument. My argument was that the fastest way out of absolute privation for the world's bottom billion people is through cheap energy.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying there. So I just working my way towards that.
Yeah.
I just want to say that just because something targets the poor is not necessarily an argument against it.
Depends on how hard it targets them, and it depends on whether mass starvation is the outcome.
The outcome is important. That I agree with. So, for instance, like a sin tax. Taxes on
the
like
outcome will be mass starvation.
I'm
in this
getting to it. Okay.
situation.
Yeah, I'm getting to it. Okay. Sin taxes on like cigarettes and alcohol are always going to disproportionately impact the poor, or even sugar, we might say, right? But just because that disproportionately impacts the poor, is that a good thing or a bad thing? These are probably the people that suffer the most from those particular afflictions. Right.
So, and that is an immediate versus delayed issue too, right? Because the reason,
I mean, obesity is an immediate. I don't think alcoholism
the reason for the tax is to stop people from pursuing a certain form of short-term gratification at the cost of their longer-term well-being.
Correct. And that exact same idea, if you believe climate models, or if you believe that we're heading in a certain direction in terms of climate, the overall warming of the planet, would be the same argument you would make for climate change.
Only if you believe that you could model economic development 100 years into the future.
Well, we're not trying to model, we're more concerned with modeling climate development than economic development.
We're
yes,
equally, okay, tell me how I'm wrong. I don't believe that, because what I see happening is two things. We have climate models that purport to explain what's going to happen over a century on the climate side, but we have economic models layered right on top of those that claim that there's going to be various forms of disaster for human beings economically as a consequence of that climate change. And so that's like two towers of Babel stacked on top of one another. And so, because if people were just saying, oh, the climate's going to change, there'd be no moral impetus in that. It's the climate's going to change, and that's going to be disastrous for the biosphere and for humanity. But that's an economic argument as well as a climate-based argument.
It's both, but the worst projections of what would happen if the climate took a disastrous turn are worse than the worst projections of what is our planet going to look like economically if we hardcore police,
right.
fossil.
Why would you? Okay, but I don't understand the distinction between the models.
Well, the argument would be that whatever pain and suffering poor people might endure right now because of a move towards green energy, that pain and suffering is going to be short-term and far less than the long-term pain and suffering.
Right, but that's dependent on the integrity of the economic models and
the climate models as well, right?
Right, exactly,
course,
but is in exactly the stacked manner that I described. And like, there's nobody in 1890 who could have predicted what was going to happen in 1990 economically. Not a bit, not a bit. And if we think we can predict like 50 years out now with the current rate of technology and calculate the potential impact of climate change on economic flourishing for human beings, we're deluded. No one can do that. And then, it's worse. So imagine that as you do that and you project outward, your margin of error increases. That's absolutely, definitely the case. And at some point, certainly on the climate side, the margin of error gets rapidly to the point where it subsumes any estimate of the degree to which the climate is going to transform. And that happens even more rapidly on the economic side.
Potentially, but right now, this is a disagreement on the fact of the matter, though, not the philosophy of what we're talking about in terms of controlling externalities. If we think, I'm curious, let's say that we think we can accurately predict the climate and the economic impact, and we think that the climate impact would be far worse if we don't account for that, both in terms of human conditions.
I don't believe any of those presumptions. I think
but then if you
faulty.
don't, but I mean, like, obviously, if I agreed with that factual analysis, I would probably agree with you on the prescription here too, right? If I thought that like none of the climate models were accurate or couldn't accurately predict anything, then I'd also say why make?
Well, they're not sufficiently accurate. That's the first thing. And because they have a margin of error, and it's a large margin of error. They don't even model cloud coverage well. That's a big problem. They don't have the resolution. They don't have nearly the resolution to produce the accuracy that's claimed by the climate apocalypse mongers.
People keep saying that, but we just got another one of the hottest years on record. How many times are we going to have another hottest year on record? How many times are we going to have an increase of carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere before we're finally like, okay.
I don't know. And the reason I don't.
There's no point of reference to say what we're experiencing right now in terms of temperature is irregular. We don't have that deep of a collection of record keeping in terms of weather patterns, temperature patterns throughout the centuries. We just have up until the last century, since the beginning of the 20th century, maybe late 19th centuries based on localities, certain nations, but that's it. We don't have a point of reference to say what we're experiencing in terms of the temperatures that we see is irregular on a century by century level. Because all we have is we can compare things by decade to the beginning of the previous century, and that's it. But these climate activists want to tell you that the world's going to end, the ice caps are going to melt. They've been saying this every decade since as long as I can remember. You can find articles from the 70s saying the same thing. The 90s, the Al Gore movement. They've never stopped with the same message. All I think they're doing is they're raising money, and this money is padding their pockets and paying for private jets. I don't know where this money is going. There's probably a good chance a small majority of it is going towards assisting environmental causes, but I promise a good 80-90% is accounted for as administrative costs. But let's go ahead and continue and listen to what Jordan Peterson has to say.
Don't know, is it because it depends, the scientific answer to that question depends precisely on the time frame over which you evaluate the climate fluctuation. And that's actually an intractable scientific problem. So you might say, well, if you take the last 100 years, this variation looks pretty dismal. And I'd say, well, what if you took the last 150,000 years? Or the last 10,000 or the last 10 million? You can't specify the damn time frame of analysis.
The time frame is incredibly important. That would be like saying, look at your, let's say somebody developed cancer and they didn't realize it, and the person has lost, 40 or 50 pounds in the past 6 months. And I'm just like, you look very sickly. And you're like, okay, well, look at my weight fluctuation over the past 10 years. You say, well, that doesn't really matter. What matters
I'm
is the
not
fact
saying
that
the time frame isn't important.
Well, but I'm saying
that it is important.
Yeah,
I'm saying I don't know how to specify it.
Well, you would probably specify it with the beginning of the industrial age, right?
Why?
Because that's when carbon dioxide, which is a gas that's seen as trapping more heat on the planet.
Why is that relevant to the time over which you compute the variability?
Because it seems like as carbon dioxide has increased in the atmosphere, the surface temperatures have risen at a rate that is a departure from what we'd expect over 150,000 year cycles of temperature variations on the planet.
No, not with that time frame. That's
absolutely.
just not the case.
It's absolutely the case.
No, what do you mean? You just flipped to 150,000 year time span.
What I'm saying is that if we expect to see a temperature do this in a 150,000 year time span, in a 100 year time span, seeing it do this, that's very worrying. Now,
you mean
it could
like
be the
Michael
case,
Mann's hockey stick, the one that's under attack right now in court by a major statistician who claimed that he falsified his data. I mean, that spike?
I'm talking about the record temperatures that have been declared for like the past 5 years that have also increased with the concentration of parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. I mean, I'm not going to tell you that every model is perfect.
They're not
right
perfect.
Now, sure, but right now we're like standing in traffic with our eyes closed saying the car hasn't hit me yet, so I don't think there's any coming. I think it's pretty undeniable at this point that there is an impact on climate across the planet. I think
that's highly deniable. We have no idea what the impact is from. We don't know where the carbon dioxide is from. We can't measure the warming of the oceans. We have terrible temperature records going back 100 years. Almost all the terrestrial temperature detection sites were first put outside urban areas, and then you have to correct. Then you have to correct for the movement of the urban areas, and then you introduce an error parameter that's larger than the purported increase in temperature that you're planning to measure. This isn't data. This is guess. And there's something weird underneath it. There's something weird that isn't oriented well towards human beings underneath it. It has this guise of compassion. Oh, we're going to save the poor in the future. It's like that's what the bloody communists said. And they killed a lot of people doing it. And we're walking down that same road now, with this insistence that, we're so compassionate that we care about the poor 100 years from now. And if we have to wipe out several 100 million of them now, well, that's a small price to pay for the future utopia. And we've heard that sort of thing before. And the alternative to that is to stop having global level elites plot out a utopian future, or even an anti-dystopian future. And that's exactly what's happening now with organizations like the WEF. And if this wasn't immediately impacting the poor in a devastating manner, I wouldn't care about it that much, but it is. I watched over the course of the last 5 years, the estimates of the number of people who were in serious danger of food privation rise from about 100 million to about 350 million. That's a major price to pay for a little bit of, what would you say, for progress on the climate front that's so narrow it can't even be measured.
I don't think the increase in hungry people on the planet is because of climate policies.
Why not?
Because I don't think that countries in Africa are being pushed away from fossil fuels. I mean, most developing nations.
Of course they are. They can't even get loans from the World Bank to pursue fossil fuel development. And there's plenty of African leaders who are screeching at the top of their lungs about that because the elites in the West have decided that, well, it was okay for us to use fossil fuel so that we wouldn't have to starve to death and our children had some opportunities. But maybe the starving masses that are too large a load for the world anyways shouldn't have that opportunity. And that's direct policy from the UN, fostered by organizations like the WEF. They're going to have to turn to renewables. Yeah, well, good luck with that, because renewables have no energy density. Besides that, they're not renewable and they're not environmentally friendly. And then one more thing. There's one more weird thing underneath all of this.
Okay.
Well, let's say if carbon dioxide was actually your bugbear and it was genuine. Well, then why wouldn't the Greens, for example, in Africa, the progressives, be agitating to expand the use of nuclear energy? Especially because Germany has to import it anyways, especially because France has demonstrated that it's possible. We could drive down the cost of energy with low-cost nuclear, and there'd be no carbon production. And then the poor people would have something to eat because they'd have enough energy. And that isn't what's happening. And that's one of the things that makes me extremely skeptical of the entire narrative. It's like two things. The left will sacrifice the poor to save the planet. And the left will deindustrialize even at the nuclear level, despite the fact that it devastates the poor. And that's even worse, because if you devastate the poor and you force them into a short-term orientation, in any given country where starvation beckons, for example, they will cut down all the trees and they will kill down all the animals and they will destroy the ecosphere. And so even by the standards of the people who are pushing the carbon dioxide externality control, all the consequences of that doctrine appear to me to be devastating, even by their own measurement principles. We're trying to fix the environment. Well, boys and girls, doesn't look like it's working. All you've managed to do is make energy 5 times as expensive and more polluting. You were wrong. That didn't work. And I can't understand. You can help me. That's why you're here today talking to me. I can't understand how the left can support this.
Just one quick thing. Let's say that everything you've said is true. What do you think is the plan then? What is the goal? What is the drive? Like, why push obviously horrible ideas for the planet and the poor?
That's a good question. That's a good question.
Well, because you're positing it, right? So what do you think is the driver goal?
Well, I listen to what people say. Here's the most terrible thing they say. There are too many people on the planet. Okay, so who says that? I've heard people say that for 30 years. Perfectly ordinary, compassionate people. Well, there's too many people on the planet. And I think, well, for me, that's like hearing Satan himself take possession of their spine and move their mouth. It's like, okay, who are these excess people that you're so concerned about? And exactly who has to go? And when? And why? And how? And who's going to make that decision? And even if you're not consciously aiming at that, you are the one who uttered the words. You're the ones who muttered the phrase. What makes you think that the thing that possessed you to make you utter that words isn't aiming at exactly what you just declared? And so that's a terrible vision. But when you look at what happens in genocidal societies, and they emerge with fair regularity, and usually with a utopian vision at hand, the consequence is the mass destruction of millions of people. So why should I assume that something horrible isn't lurking like that right now, especially given that we have pushed a few 100 million people back into absolute poverty when we were doing a pretty damn good job of getting rid of that? And I just don't understand what's happening in Germany or in the UK. Like, it's insane. Like, look, man, if they would have got rid of the nuclear plants and made energy 5 times as expensive, and the consequence would have been they weren't burning lignite coal as a backup, and their unit production of energy, of pollution per unit of energy had plummeted, you could say, well, look, we hurt a lot of poor people, but at least the air is cleaner. It's like, no, air's worse and everyone's poorer. So explain to me how the hell the left can be anti-nuclear.
Okay.
I don't understand it at all.
Gotcha. All right. This is something that I brought up earlier that is concerning to me. I feel like when people get political beliefs, I feel like what happens is what we think happens, what we would hope happen is you have some moral or philosophical underpinning. And then from there, you combine this with some epistemic understanding of the world. And then you combine these two things, you engage in some form of analysis. And through your moral
It'd be
view,
nice if that was true.
you start to apply like prescriptions. So maybe I'm religious, maybe I analyze society and I see that particular TV shows lead to premarital sex. So my societal prescription is we should ban these TV shows, right? Ideally, this is how you would imagine this process works. What I find happens, unfortunately, all too often is what people do is they join social groups. And then with those social groups, they inherit something that I call like a constellation of beliefs. And this constellation of beliefs, instead of rationally building on each of these, you basically get this like Jenga tower that is like floating over a table and every block is like supporting itself and no real part of the tower can be addressed because if you pull out one piece, it all falls apart. So people become like very stuck in all of this combined constellation stuff and none of it is really given like any analysis and you can't really push anybody from one way or another in terms of like reevaluating any of the beliefs that are part of this constellation. I wish I would have.
That's good.
Yep,
That's fine. That's right.
The fact that Destiny was able to sit here and argue against Jordan Peterson on whether or not you can verify the temperature fluctuations that we're experiencing on planet Earth today, when Peterson says we don't, basically what I said as well, there's no reference point to say this is irregular. Peterson also posited the idea that if we had maybe 150,000 years rather than 150 or a million years, then okay, fine. We can have an argument because now we can measure on a century by century or a decacentury by decacentury basis. But he doesn't understand that, and he's making these interesting arguments. And I'm just like, oh, this is why I can't understand the Destiny fans. Why do people listen to what he has to say? Like, okay, fine. I'm not saying he's a bad person or anything. He might have interesting things to say here and there, but overall, just his entire ideology is deceptively far left. He's able to play the part of a moderate. I mean, he said he existed as a conservative beforehand. He's able to play this part as like someone who's moderate. But when you really like pick at his arguments, he starts to truly reveal who he is. And he starts to say the things that is like, okay, that's completely in line with what the far left believes. But obviously it's a very intriguing debate between the two. I just want to go ahead and just watch that in real time. I'm not going to go through all of it. I think it's like twice the length. It's been like an hour already. So, man, you guys let me know your comments down below. Like, comment. Of course, don't forget to follow me, The Furnished Mind, here on YouTube, as well as on Instagram and Twitter. We're going to keep this going. We're going to keep this going till the wheels fall off. So, with that being said, deuces.